Hey everyone, Pastor Rob here. I am excited to have another conversation here on questions of faith and belief and doubt and how do we as Christians, how do we make sense of all of this? I'm here today with Dave Dykstra, and Dave volunteered. He sent me a message and had some really thoughtful questions that I thought are really worth exploring and digging into. I'm not gonna introduce Dave for him. I'm going to let him tell his own story. But I want to thank Dave. I want to thank you for joining me and for being willing to have some conversation and dialogue on this. And maybe if you just start by telling us a little bit about your story, and we'll go from there.
Sounds good. Well, I guess I'll let everybody know that I've known Pastor Rob now for several years. I'm actually his wife's cousin, so we've known each other for quite some time. My background is very much, I went to Calvin University, Calvin College at the time, grew up deeply entrenched in the Christian Reformed Church, and have experienced a lot of doubts here. Prior to the pandemic had started, but certainly during the pandemic, just a lot of things kind of came out, just some activities that I did, which I'll explain, which just has me, I guess, questioning. I think I mentioned in my messages that I find the older I get, the less certain of things I am. Or I think when I was in college and in high school, I thought I had all the answers. And now I realize I don't know a whole lot. So just to give you a backdrop, when the pandemic started, I actually engaged in a process. His name is Peter Rollins. I'm not sure if you're familiar with who Peter Rollins is. But I engaged in, he does this thing called Atheism for Lent, where you do a lot of readings, some of them from an atheist perspective, some of them from a theologian perspective, and it kind of wrestles with a lot of the same questions, like the problem of evil, a lot of these different issues, and the point to it. And it was a difficult thing to go through, actually. But the general point is to realize that whether you come at these questions from a theological perspective or from a perspective of there is no God, that a lot of us end up stuck in the same spots, if that makes any sense, and that they're much more closely related. Actually, when it starts, he shows like a comic story, just a picture of like the superheroes and the villains all sitting in a bar together, like kind of after work, and the point of it is just to kind of show that really they're all part of the same group of people, even though it looks like they're coming from different sides, but they're kind of getting together and having conversations, and that's really kind of how it starts, and I hope that's kind of what we're doing today. Really what I'm hoping that this will turn into.
Right. So. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think that, because I think what I hear you saying is that sometimes people can become so certain of their beliefs and their convictions that they almost become entrenched and they sort of lock down, and they don't, when you find yourself in that position, it becomes really hard to hear a different point of view, and sometimes even people who maybe they might differ from you, but they might not be as far apart as you as a person might think, right? Like you get so locked in that anything that sounds remotely different is automatically labeled as, the other. And it's interesting you mentioned COVID as part of that. I'm curious, if maybe you don't want to, but I'm just curious if you'd elaborate on how the pandemic played into all that, or how did that factor in?
I think it was more just during the pandemic, it was a time to really step back and reflect on a whole lot of things. And that just looked like a really cool thing to do. Like I said, I was already feeling doubts, and I just thought it would just be a really cool experience to read from different people's perspectives that I hadn't read before. And honestly, when you read it, Nietzsche was a lot of it. There's a lot of stuff that you read where like, these are some really deep thinkers that are out there. Unfortunately, they can mess you up pretty bad. As my wife can probably testify, as I was going through it and talking, I think I came out of it okay, but I wouldn't recommend that activity for someone who's certainly doesn't have a background. I think it could really do more damage than good for a lot of people. I think it damaged me somewhat, to be quite frank. I think I'm left with still trying to put the pieces back together.
Yeah.
I talked to pastor of my church at the time, and I'll fully admit I haven't gone back, and I can explain a little bit about that. I think a lot of people think I haven't gone back for some different reasons, but he said, you're going through a deconstruction process. He's like, you need someone to help reconstruct it. And I haven't gone through that step yet. I'm trying, but the whole reconstruction piece is so certain authors, writers, I can mention like Rob Bell, Brian McLaren, Peter Rollins, those types of people do a good job of tearing everything down. But how do you rebuild it back after you're kind of left with a bunch of pieces lying around and going, I just don't know how they all fit together anymore.
Is there benefit, and if so, like what is the advantage, or what is the gain from tearing all these things down? Like it's painful, but is there benefit in that? Is there something, like, what good comes out of that?
I think the first one is I guess the best example I can think of is going back to that comic strip of, I think it gets very easy to become a we versus them. When I think like being Christian Reformed, well, we have the answers and the Catholic Church does not. Or we have the answers and the Muslims do not. And there's more to, I'm not saying that all roads, I don't claim to be universalist. Please don't mishear me.
Sure.
But
sure.
But I think it gets very easy to kind of look like we're on the good team, or we're the right team. Even at Edward Jones, sometimes it's like, well, we're wearing the right uniform, and those people from Morgan Stanley, they got it wrong. When in reality, there's really good people out there doing good work at different firms. Same thing there's really good people at other churches and other religions that are doing good work, and to discount them.
So you're kind of getting at this. It pulls you out of the tribalism. Is that what you're saying? Like it sort of forces you to take a different vantage point and say, okay, we've got to be careful against hunkering down with our own tribe, whatever that tribe might be. And in this case, Christian Reform, but if it's denominationalism, if it's religion, if it's vocation, if it's, corporate culture, whatever, there's always this sort of pull towards, and I guess that's why I asked about how COVID played into it, because I was wondering a little bit that was a very tribalistic time, and at least in my judgment, like, you were on the right or you on the left, you were Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, you were, it was just like everything was so tightly defined by what tribe you were a part of, and that seemed to not be a healthy place to be, at least in my judgment.
Because you mentioned that, and I'm certainly not speaking for all churches or for all, but I can speak about the Christian Reformed Church, the Reformed churches that are around here, which is where I'm most comfortable. It's really hard because you see the character of Donald Trump all of a sudden getting somehow brought into church, which to me is just a tragedy. Or you see, like you said, all of a sudden, if you support Black Lives Matter, which I happen to support, people, that's a non-Christian organization. I'm like, not so much. So when people are like, why don't you go back to churches? Because when I go back, that voice is very loud in the churches around here. Right. And it really kind of like it upsets me if that makes, and I don't want.
It makes a lot of sense. I get that. Yeah, because then you're importing a lot of other stuff that begins to shape the church. And it's not that the church can't have people of different convictions and beliefs on lots of issues, social issues, political, right, etc. But the church as an institution began to be shaped by a lot of that external stuff. I think you're right on that.
And I don't think it's necessarily the pastors. I don't think it's the church's fault. I just think like there's accepted, like if you have that viewpoint, you're allowed to be loud.
Yeah, right.
And if you have an alternative viewpoint, you're kind of, you can either like stay and talk and try to engage in dialogue, and you almost get like shouted down. And this is my experience, doesn't mean it's true everywhere, and so it just becomes a point where you just don't feel like you want to do it anymore. Actually I just read a book by Brian McLaren, which the question was, do I stay Christian? And that's what it talked about, was there's people like myself that don't feel necessarily like we have a voice anymore inside the church. And his encouragement is that we go and we speak up. However, that's painful, and I'm not ready to I guess take that on, if that makes any sense. And I have no desire to go and just back up the truck a little bit. You probably, I don't know if you recall, I remember you were watching a conversation I had with my RA one time on Facebook, back in my Facebook days where I actually engaged. And I loved the shouting down. I loved the going back and forth and trying to prove my point of view. And I thought that was like cool.
Yeah, right.
I got to a point where even prior to the pandemic, I'm like, I don't want to be that person anymore because I don't have the answers either. I don't, that's why I was a little worried about this, because I didn't want this to be, well, here's my point, and then you're telling me your point, and then we end up, that's just, that doesn't do anybody any good.
Right.
So that's where I guess that's how I feel, but that doesn't mean that's truth. I want to be very clear with that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, that's it. I think that's an insightful critique. I mean, I think there's a pitfall too, like, because then those voices, like, okay, you get these people, and I think you're right. It's a very loud, almost belligerent voice, and like you say, it's not every church, it's not everywhere, but it's there. But is there a possibility that, okay, so then let's say you take the advice of Brian McLaren to go in and speak up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a possibility then that becomes the loud and dominating voice? Like, and I don't know what to do with that other than just to name that as an observation, right? Because then you get then now we're going to become the louder voice that shouts down, and then we just swung the pendulum.
Well, it goes back to what Peter Rollins calls the goodies and the baddies, whichever things, whatever you think you believe becomes the goodies, and they're the baddies because they don't like you. And that's really not helpful in any case. I've watched.
It's the tribalism again. It's just that the tribes in power, so to speak, have just shifted, right? Like you just sort of get this.
Family members on the other side, they've got all the, they're the right ones because they believe, they're more the liberal point of view. And it's like, well, no, actually, conservatives have a point too.
Right. Yeah, that's like so this is a non-Christian source, but I'm reminded of like what Jonathan Haidt has written about a lot. He I don't know if you've read him, but he starts off younger in life, and he was a very progressive liberal, and then he goes and he spends some time in India, and he realized, like, here's a culture where they actually arrange your marriages, and socially they're very, what we would look at as very conservative, and he's like, that actually seems to work, and maybe it's not all bad, and maybe all the things that my liberal friends had said were maybe a little bit narrow as well. And so it's sort of like, it doesn't always, in fact, it often doesn't fit into these neat categories that we wish it would, I think.
Right.
So I'm curious, and I wanted you, because one of the things that you said, and just as we were setting this up, you said that faith and doubt are dance partners. And I thought that was an intriguing idea. Like, I'm curious, if you could just expand on what you mean by that. That was sort of, I like that imagery, but I'm just curious what you mean.
I watched some of my youngest daughter. I can bring up. I watch her, and she's very involved in youth group, and she's a questioner. She just naturally questions everything. Like, are you sure it's that way? And I watch her. And I think some of her youth group friends think that she's not really a Christian because she's questioning. And I'm like, well, I think she's actually closer to God than someone who just is accepting what they believe because their parents want to believe. Like, she's actually doing the work. It's scary as a parent. I'll completely admit, and I know I fostered that, which I think is a good thing, but it's also a scary thing to go, well, she's like, she's got thoughts that
actually go and do the things that you've taught them to do. It's like,
I'm very proud of her, and but I want her to believe in God. I want her to have I don't know how you call it, like, relationship with Jesus. I don't know exactly what that means, but I want her to have, but she continues to stay in the youth group and continues to do this, so she is doing that. But I think sometimes she'll say, she doesn't necessarily know what she believes, so she must not be a very good person or whatever. And I just don't think that's true. I kind of find myself in the same boat. I mean, one of the things that I'm working through is whole this imagery of God as the Father, and then you have Jesus, and then you have the Holy Spirit. But I get stuck because it's almost like we're like, well, this is God, and like almost like Jesus really wasn't God. He was just like an offspring of God. And I'm like, but if Jesus was truly 100% God, which I believe, sometimes we like discount the fact that this is during Atheism for Lent, that Jesus actually died on the cross, and God actually died. And that's a strange phenomenon to me. A very strange, like it just kind of lets your whole world kind of comes crashing down. Like, wait a minute, if God's all powerful, how in the world? And that's another thing I mentioned to you is this whole atonement theory has me really messed up. Like, this God's really angry and like seems to hate everybody. So he sent his son to die, like, because he needed to, like he's so bloodthirsty. And then the question comes, if this is what we believe, and I know that's a general tenet of Christianity, is that a God I really want to go be with?
Right. Yeah, I had that. It's an interesting question to me, because I recorded one of these videos earlier this week, and from it's very clear he's a professing, he would call himself an agnostic atheist. So, and one of the things that he said is, well, look, similar to, you've got this God. I can't believe in a God that is, commanding genocide and all this other stuff, the Old Testament stuff. And one of the things I said to him, and I'm not even sure exactly myself what to do. Well, I have my own take on this, but I said, well, the nature, your evaluation of God doesn't really determine his existence, right? In other words, let's just assume for the sake of argument that God really is a tyrant and he's evil, and, that doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't exist. But it does raise that question of, well, if he does exist, do you want to just get on his good side? Or is it, there's more to the story than is often presented? Like, is the whole bloodthirsty God, is that a mischaracterization? Is there more that maybe we're not seeing right away? Or is it just, you know what, if that's who God is, fine, but I want nothing to do with it. Like,
Where I tend to go is, I think a lot of those images of God are because you're looking at ancient text. And I'm not saying the Bible isn't true, but you look at ancient text, and that was how they understood gods at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that's who God, well, that's what they ascribed to him, or it, or whatever that being was, because that's what they understood. And sometimes when you take that God and put him in 2023, it doesn't make as much sense.
Right.
Because we're really not in that world anymore.
Right.
Where we
culturally different.
Or like with thunderbolts and things, it just, that imagery doesn't make it as much sense as it used to. So when going back to your faith and doubt is like, okay, Peter Rollins talks about different ways of thinking about God, and first one is God being like that super being. Mm-hmm. And where I'm kind of at is, I don't know, I don't understand that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I don't understand that. But I like more of God. He calls it God being the ground of being, that out of God comes everything. And it just gives me a bigger, broader sense of who God is, and that Jesus is a part of that and really understood that more so than you have this super being and then this other being and then this spiritual being that kind of comes. There's more like just the essence of God. Out of God comes everything. Now you're going to run into the problem of evil.
Right.
But what was fascinating about the problem of evil is an atheist would say God can't exist because of evil. I come back and go, if God didn't exist, how can we even define evil?
I was just right, exactly. I was just going to say, because you're using a moral category to disprove a moral being, right? You're saying there's evil in the world, therefore there can't be God. But in saying, when you name something evil, you've actually just described to it a moral character. And where does that come from? Like, how do we define evil and good? What, if there's no God, then really what grounding do we have? I mean, that's a classical argument. What grounding do we have for actually positing that there is such a thing as good and evil?
Honestly, if you're a true atheist, then it should be just plain old survival of the fittest. Like, I can do whatever I want as long as I get away with it. Right. But none of us really believe that.
Right.
I think if you really look at it, no, there's certain things you shouldn't do. Right. We just came back from Vegas, and my wife and I don't do anything wrong, but you're certainly observing. I mean,
Sure.
we do things wrong. Like, I mean,
Yeah, no.
but we're not out there like living like the hangover lifestyle in Vegas, but you certainly can observe it. And as you're watching this consumption of things, of alcohol, of drugs, of tobacco, of sex, of all that kind of stuff, and it's like a good time to get away. But certainly, I'm on the plane, and I was thinking about this conversation. I'm on the plane. I'm like, I can't wait to go back to my life. Like that life is so empty,
Right.
and I just want to go home and be fulfilled and filled again because I feel emptied out.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting.
You know,
Because so what I think you just raised something that has got my wheels a little bit turning, because it's not only is there absence of morality, like if you take God out of the picture, I think what we kind of said is you lose your basis for describing morality, but you're actually taking it in a different direction as well. You're saying life becomes meaningless.
right.
And it's interesting. I was watching a debate on this just yesterday, and the woman, she was an atheist. That's the title that she owned, and she's like, well, and she's a professor, so she's like, I tell my students all the time, life is meaningless and there's no point to it. And so what do you have to do? Well, you got to wake up and you've got to create meaning by putting your slippers on, and you've got to create meaning by going to the loo. She's British, and so it's like, well, you just okay, I'm going to the bathroom, so I guess that's meaning. And it's like, yeah, but really, is that really what you're pushing? That is that become something you want to shape the world, that there is no meaning and there is no purpose, and so just do whatever you want and create whatever meaning. That doesn't seem to really, like you say, it empties you out. It doesn't leave you really feeling fulfilled.
And I guess when I go back to my daughter, like if that's the direction she goes in, it makes me sad. Because I think life can be so fulfilling.
Yeah.
And God's got to be a part of that. But
Right.
how to find this
Right.
being is where that's where the doubt comes, and the whole I can't, because
Right.
I'm having a hard time with that Zeus-like God up there that I kind of believed in. It was like, well, here's what you have to do this in order to, I joke, like going to church. This is like one thing that gives me like a visceral physical feeling. Like when people are like, why don't you go to church? Like you sing songs about how wretched you are and how bad you are. Like a lot of the lyric, like in the hymns are like, and I'm struggling with that part. Like I go like, okay, if one of my kids came to me and told me what a horrible human being they were, and I'm glad you love me anyways, I'd be like, what is your problem? Yeah. That's not how I view you. So I have a hard time with God viewing me in that fashion. If I'm not going to view I know my kids aren't perfect, but I don't love them anyways. That's more the God I want. But it seems like when we sing songs, it's just like I really should be wiped off the face of the planet, but you're all powerful, so I'm glad that you're not destroying me.
I got one last question for you.
I don't, as I'm going on tangents here, sorry.
No, it's great. That's the whole point. There's no such thing as a tangent here. It's just all part of the conversation. But here's my last question, and we'll go on as many tangents as we want to go on. Is there, to what extent is certainty important? Like, are there things that you think you can and should be certain about in this whole realm?
I guess I'll share what I still consider my pastor, because I still have great respect for the pastor of the church that I guess I'm still part of, even though I haven't gone back since the pandemic. He said, is truth a set of propositions to defend, or is truth a person to follow? And if truth is a person to follow, we should be looking at the life of Jesus and going, how did that man live his life, and how do I emulate that? I think there's where I think certainty should be. And I should be spending my days trying, the whole what would Jesus do? I mean, it turned into a bracelet and kind of cool, which nobody actually did that. But because the problem is when you look at his life, all kinds of questions surface of how do you live like Jesus when that man was, I mean, that's where I look at like my office. I look at what I do for a living sometimes and even question that, go, I'm trying to help people build wealth, but there was a man that building wealth was not important to. So then it makes you question, like, well, am I even doing the right thing here? Yeah, I think I'm helping people, don't get me wrong, but like it can lead to all sorts of questions. So when you say what is certainty, I think it is looking at the life of Jesus and how would he treat people. And that's where I'm looking for when I'm ready to engage in church, that's, I guess, what I'm looking for is, where's a church that's going to say, it doesn't matter if you're gay, doesn't matter if you're, what you're not, you don't look or act or feel like me, we're going to love you. Because that's what Jesus would do.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm looking for. And I think it's out there. I just haven't taken the time to try to find it. And it could be in my old church too. I think that I don't want to mention his name, but I think that pastor's trying to form that, but it's hard to take a body of people that are so entrenched in the old ways and lead them there. So really, you might have the same feelings. So
yeah. I ask it because I can relate to this the importance of asking questions and to wrestling with stuff, like, and some of that I think is maybe, for lack of better terms, just a personality thing. Like, I think some people are just wired to not sit well with simple pat answers, and they want to just question everything. And then I think there are, because I'm thinking of people just in my own church, and we've got both, and because we've got people that are just they're content with the answers, they believe them, they're good with that, and then there's people that just want to ask questions, and I think there's value in both, right? Like, I think I tend to be more towards I like to ask questions and wonder about this, although I've got my place for certainty as well. But I think of something I read, by C.S. Lewis. I think it's in The Abolition of Man. I'm not certain on that, but he kind of says, because he went through the same process, and he kind of said, I came to realize that, transparency is good on stuff. In other words, you've got to be able to ask questions and try to look through things. But he said, at some point, the point of looking through a window is to be able to see outside. It's to be able to see something. If everything is transparent, then you're looking through everything, and then nothing is real anymore. And he kind of says, I just came to the point, I realized that was a really not good place to be, because then there's nothing, you've got nothing left. And so I've always kind of wondered that where do you need to have a window, and where do you need to be able to see through that window to something that is like solid and real. And I'm not saying, I'm by no means saying that, because I think that's different for everyone. And I love the fact that that your daughter's asking those questions in youth group. Like, I'm like you, I encourage my kids to ask them too, but there is that risk attached to it too. It's like, well, ask questions, but don't ask too many questions, because you still want them to come out solid in the end, or at least grounded in something.
And I guess maybe that's why I feel like the pieces aren't put back together yet. Like, I believe there is certainty.
Yeah.
I just don't see it yet, or I can't quite, but I'm okay with that, actually, because
right.
Believing that there is something that's not all meaningless.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to get there. I'm only 47. I got years left to figure it out. And I think God loves me anyways. Because and that's partly where I had to come to you kind of mentioned there's always people that ask questions. I remember in high school sitting in like my Bible class in high school, because I went to a Christian school, and we had to like prove something. And so it was like, well, we had to go find a Bible verse in order to prove it. I remember just thinking, like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, so I'm a financial advisor. Like, if I wrote my own book on financial advising, someone says, well, why is that true? Well, because read this book. And then, well, it turns out you're the author. It's one of those, it never sat.
Circular reasoning, right? Like the Bible says it's true. And yeah.
Right. So we're busy looking up words that we all believe. It just, for me, I remember in high school, and this just seems like a pointless exercise. Like, there's got to be more to it than this. So I've always been one of those people that have asked questions. And yeah, I like you agree that if there's no certainty, then you're going to go down a dark hole. And I think I've kind of gone down the dark hole, and I'm finding my way out. And I'm excited to see where it leads. And like I said, I think God loves me anyways. I think God loves my kids anyways, despite the fact that we're maybe born to ask more questions than maybe what's healthy. It's been fun. My wife is more of a who cares? Like, it doesn't, like, I won't use the language she uses. So I don't give a poopology is what she says. Like, we don't have to prove anything, Dave. Like, just believe it. Like, it's all right. It's all right. That's just where, So, but I think in the end, I guess ultimately, I think in the end, God's got a plan for this world. I think God's got a plan for more people than what we would include. And that's the conclusion I come to is I think we all tend to think like this, our tribe or whatever is the way to heaven. And I would almost like to throw heaven out and say, how do we bring heaven to earth? And let's worry about that. And God will take care of the rest for most people, I believe. You mentioned C.S. Lewis. I think the book that was helpful for me was The Great Divorce.
Yeah. That's a great little read. Yeah. I
Where
love
for
that book.
me, for me, I guess where I take comfort is like if I don't, if God knows no span, so if I don't do or say or think the right things in this life, that there'll be time for me in the afterlife for me to kind of go through the whole great divorce part for me to still discover the absolutes at that point in time. Like I don't know if it's necessarily true that you have to say and do and believe exactly the right things for whatever time God puts you on this planet. There might be time for you later. So maybe I believe in a purgatory, or a time in between where you still have time to figure it out if you don't get it right in this planet. And please don't hear that as me saying you shouldn't try to find truth. I just know, you don't know what you don't know how much time you have. So
yeah, that's very true as well. Like that is a certainty, right? Like our own mortality, is a certainty, which, yeah, if you think of it, it's maybe an uncomfortable way to press the point, but it's to say there's some urgency in this too, then.
right.
Yeah.
But that's why I'll ask you a question, I guess, if we
Yeah,
want to
of
close.
course.
One thing that like I think of, like we have this urgency of let's just say that we got to get everybody to believe in Jesus before they die. Because if they don't, they're going to hell. Shouldn't we all be working a lot harder on that if that's the case? And I'm not saying it's not the case, but shouldn't we all be walking around with bullhorns and trying to convert as many people as possible? If it's that grave of a thing, like I should be looking at my neighbors who I love, who are Muslim, and going, I should be doing whatever I can to get them to believe these things. But I don't feel like that's the right behavior. For me, it's like be a good neighbor to them and treat them well. But I don't know.
Those are not mutually exclusive, though, are they? I mean, if I had Muslim neighbors, I don't, but if I did, I would fully expect them to win me over to their way of life, because presumably they find their worldview most satisfying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so and conversely, if I find Christianity to be the worldview that is the most satisfying answer, that provides the most satisfying answers for meaning and purpose and morality and destiny and origin and all those other things, it's not just, hey, I need to try to convince you to join my tribe. At least it shouldn't be, although it certainly can be that way and often is that way. But it should be more, listen, I've come to know something that I think makes real sense, and I think it gives real hope, and I want you to know about that. Now, at the same time, I think there's also a big part of that is, let me be a good neighbor to you, and let me love you. I don't care, because I think that's one of the things that sets Christianity apart too, or at least it should, is that if you think of it in terms of tribal loyalties, which, okay, it's got its downside too, but one of the questions is, okay, so what worldview or what perspective gives you the impetus to love the people who are not of your tribe? And I think, like it or not, just about every other worldview or religion says my tribe is the right one and yours is the wrong, and therefore you are the enemy. Whereas Christianity essentially is about, God coming to us, loving us when we're not part of his tribe, you might say. I mean, we're enemies and opposed and all that. And if God does that with us, then that becomes the reason that says, you know what, you're not part of my tribe, but I love you anyways. I mean, you're different from me. You think differently. You believe differently. You live differently. You're that person in Vegas who, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, all that stuff. But I'm no better than you. In one sense, I'm fundamentally no different from you. So I'm going to love you. And I want to show you that all the things that you're looking for, I think, can be satisfied in the gospel. I mean, that's kind of how I approach it, so that it actually says, yeah, there's these different tribes or whatever terminology you want to use, but there's an incentive and an impetus and a reason to say the whole point is to cross those bridges and to love those other tribes. And in doing so, you begin to people begin to see, hopefully, ideally, that Christianity is something different. So, yeah, it's loving your neighbor, but I think it's also if you believe that your worldview is satisfying in the sense of all those tough existential questions, you want people to come to know it as well.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I mean, that's probably as good as we're going to find.
I think so. Right.
Pushing me to go, okay, what more do I do? Yeah,
Yeah.
But I got to think that through. So.
Yeah. Well, this has been really good. I think this is a good place to stop. So, thank you, Dave. This was just, it's got my mind going now too. So which is good. I like that. Thank you for taking the time and being a part of the channel. And yeah, we'll connect again at some point. I'm going to stop the recording now. So thanks again, Dave.
You're welcome.